Welcome to the panel using trade policy to tackle climate change and protect environment. In the next hour and 10 minutes, we are going to discuss one of the most probably underestimated and overlooked ways to tackle climate change and environmental protection, trade. As Mr. Potočnik said in his excellent presentation, 50% of all physical trade is linked to fossil fuel, and an additional 20% to mining. At the same time, we see that fossil fuel subsidies amount to no less than $500 billion worldwide. This not only creates a market distortion and a consumer bias, it is clearly contradicting any climate change and environmental goal. Whoever has traveled around the world has heard the words European standards. It is often used as a magic formula to convince you the product they want to sell you is of the highest quality. With this panel, we want to try to find out how Europe can use its free trade agreements to make the so-called European standards also good for climate and environment. In other words, how can Europe use trade to improve global policy towards climate change and environmental protection? For this discussion, we are very lucky to have a panel with 4 fantastic speakers. First of all, Special Envoy Stéphane Dion, who is Special Envoy of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Canada's ambassador to Germany. Secondly, we have Nathalie Bernasconi-Osterwalder, who is Executive Director of the International Institute for Sustainable Development Europe, and also Senior Director Economic Law and Policy at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Thirdly, we have Geneviève Pons, who is Director General and Vice President of the Institut Jacques Delors. And finally, we have again Janez Potočnik, who is co-chair now of the UN Environment Programme International Resource Panel. I will give each one of you 3 minutes for opening remarks. The subject matter is political, but also technical. That's why I would like to ask you to be not too technical and avoid abbreviations. And also, let's try to make this panel as interactive as possible. So raise your hand if you want to react. We will respond to public questions in the last 20 minutes of this panel. I'll now give the floor to Special Envoy Dion, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Debeuf. I will use my 3 minutes maybe to go to the basic of our topic of today, which is how to design trade in a way that trade will help more the transition we need to do toward zero carbon economy, zero emission economy, and also to protect the environment. The basic point I would like to make, because we'll have other opportunities to go further in the debate later, is that we will need trade. Whatever we do, we should not weaken our ability to trade to each other. We need to design trade in a way that it will speed up the dissemination of clean tech solutions and the best practices and so on. We need trade for that. It's the best way to do it. Now we'll need to find a way that it will be a race to the top and not a race to the bottom. That's the key point I want to say. Because the task we have to do, and I would like to mention it at the very beginning, that keep that in mind, is huge. It's an enormous task. As we speak, as you mentioned it, Mr. Debeuf, it's 50% of our trade linked to oil and gas, but 84% of the source of primary energy of the world is linked to oil, gas, and coal, 84%. And it was 84% about in 1990. So it did not budge despite all our efforts. And we want to go to zero for 2050 for Canada, the EU, Japan, US with President Biden, and about 12 other countries, UK, to be at zero emission for 2050. But 2050 is 30 years from now. It's tomorrow. So how can we do it if we don't facilitate the dissemination of our best practices and technologies and low cost and so on through trade? If there is an innovation, I'm sure there are a lot in Czechoslovakia, I want that to be in the Canadian market as soon as possible. And for that, we need trade. And for Czechoslovakia to phase out their coal power plants, maybe Canada has a lot to offer. I'm sure of it. And especially regarding also even the nuclear technology. We may provide a lot of support. Canada is the fourth innovator of the world for clean technology. It has been ranked fourth. So for hydrogen, for carbon storage, for water management, and so on, Canada has a lot to offer. And thanks God that we're a trading nation. And when I look at the CETA accord we have with the EU, which is the trade agreement we have, where we design strong chapters on the environment, on trade, on climate, how much it's helped to have our cooperation beyond trade itself, cooperation for science, for technology. I just want to use these 3 minutes and I conclude on that. We need to design trade in a way that will have a race to the top because we cannot do it without trade.
Thank you so much, Special Envoy. I would like to give the floor to Ms. Bernasconi-Osterwalder, please. Your 3 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very, very much for inviting IISD to this event, and it's a real honor to be part of this very distinguished panel. The EU is really already an environmental leader, and most recently, of course, with its ambitious green recovery package. And trade agreements really must be aligned with the EU's environmental ambitions and commitments and not undermine them. In addition, these agreements must positively contribute to the EU's overarching sustainable development goals and commitments. So agreements such as CETA, as we just heard, they include provisions to guarantee governments their right to regulate in the public interest. However, risks persist, especially in the context of investment, where the treaty still allows investors to sue the government directly, alleging certain violations and lost profits, which can put in jeopardy those policies linked to the low carbon transition. And we know that with the Energy Charter Treaty, which is a sectoral investment treaty, the EU is already considering carving out fossil fuel investments from protection under the deal's scope. And these issues should be taken account and taken seriously in future trade and investment agreements as well. But along with doing no harm, trade agreements really can complement environmental policies and help achieve international environmental commitments. Current EU agreements include sustainable development chapters, as we heard, and even though their ambition and binding nature sometimes vary. So these chapters are subject to a compliance mechanism, which may not lead, like some other of Canada's trade agreements, to trade sanctions, but can still play an important role in holding states accountable. However, the mechanism's effectiveness, of course, depends on the rules that the mechanisms aim to uphold. And on this front, agreements could be improved, for example, by incorporating robust climate change provisions. Future EU agreements should address fossil fuel subsidies, for example, because these are not compatible, as we heard in the introductory, with the Paris Agreement commitments. Trade agreements could also introduce, in this sense, could introduce principles and disciplines on the use of fossil fuel subsidies and prohibit certain types of subsidies altogether, although this approach would have to be adapted depending on the situation, especially for FTAs, free trade agreements, or partnership agreements with developing states. EU agreements could also entrain countries to distinguish between different types of investments, depending on their contribution to sustainability, and they could treat them accordingly. For example, investments in certain sectors, such as coal, could be disallowed or barred from accessing export finance, and instead, home states could commit to providing finance to green outward investment. These are some ideas that IISD, my organization, developed in our proposal for a climate-friendly investment agreement, which actually won the so-called Stockholm Treaty Lab Prize. The approach would send a strong signal to investors and contribute to achieving climate objectives. So to sum up, I would propose first, ensuring policy space and avoiding chilling effects, also by limiting the use of investor-state dispute settlement. Second, disciplining fossil fuel subsidies. And third, distinguishing between sustainable and other investments. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your opening remarks. Now I would like to give the word to Geneviève, Ms. Geneviève Pons.
Yes, thank you very much. Really glad to be with you. It's a very important subject. As you know, because I shared them with you, I will base my remarks on the work we are going with Pascal Lamy and Pierre Le Turc on greening trade. Okay, so I will make 4 points. First of all, the EU can strengthen its FTAs in a positive and cooperative manner. Second, a carbon border adjustment mechanism is justified, should be introduced in a cooperative manner. Third, the conditions are there for greening the multilateral agenda, at least much better than a few months ago. And finally, the EU should accelerate the work on market access, domestic standards, and due diligence. So on the first point, FTAs can be strengthened, and we should do it in a positive manner. There is a growing consensus on that. France is not alone in this endeavor. France and the Netherlands have published together a non-paper on this question. And there are maybe 3 points I would like to make on that. First of all, the respect of the Paris Agreement should become an essential element of future FTAs, free trade agreement. Sustainable impact assessment should be published before the signing of the agreement to allow a timely and informed public debate. And third, environmental and climate-related tariff conditionality should be introduced in a positive manner, providing for preferential gradation, rewarding the realization of environmental objectives. Second, EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. We believe it is justified, but it should be introduced in a cooperative manner or it will be dead from the start. There is a need to progress on carbon pricing in order to reach carbon neutrality while avoiding carbon leakage. And a carbon border adjustment mechanism can play this role. Second, in order to ensure the compatibility of such a mechanism with the WTO, an open and transparent governance of the mechanism will be key, as well as the use of revenues, notably to facilitate the transition and innovation in developing countries. I think that presently there is room for maneuver at international level on cooperation on carbon border mechanism, but also more largely on greening the multilateral trade agenda, for reasons that nobody can ignore, the election of Mr. Biden, of course, but also the fact that Mr. Xi Jinping has committed his country to carbon neutrality by 2060. Such an agenda could contain a code of conduct on carbon border adjustment mechanism, a relaunch of the negotiation of an environmental good agreement extended to services, and that could start with goods linked to the energy transition, and end to the most harmful subsidies, namely the fisheries subsidies, for which a compromise, a good compromise is on the table. And of course, fossil fuel subsidies, where a commitment could be included in the next ministerial declaration at the WTO. We can also, and this is my final point, act in a unilateral manner at EU level by setting ambitious standards. And REACH has been a very good example in this regard, triggering ambitious similar standards elsewhere in the world, starting with the US. And we, for that reason, welcome the resolution that the European Parliament has adopted the 22nd of October for deforestation-free standards to be proposed by the Commission. We will base our next publication on the power of ambitious standards. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. So let me give now the floor to Mr. Potočnik. I leave it up to you if you want to do some extra introductory open remarks, or if you want to react on what has been said so far. Well, you have 3 minutes for making that choice.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I will do both, because introduction was already quite thorough and there I have anything to add. But since you were telling us that we should not be too much technical, more political, and I think that's the right thing. Actually, you have to mix both. But what is for me most important is that we actually understand and share what is the world in which we are currently living. We are the first generation ever in this planet which is living in socio-ecological space of planetary scope. So we are more interconnected and more interdependent than anybody was ever, which means that our individual and collective responsibility has enormously increased. And I think we should simply be aware of that fact. Club of Rome has nicely said that we have moved from so-called empty world, which was dominated by humans, to by nature, to the full world, which is now dominated by humans. And in the empty world, it was labor and infrastructure, which were the limiting factors of human well-being, while in the full world, it's actually environmental things and how we will treat the natural resources, which are the factors, core factors of our human well-being. So understanding that means that any future economic question, without taking into account environmental questions, and natural resource management is simply misleading debate. So in that context, of course, multilateralism and cooperation, it's a kind of logical consequence. So if we don't see that during the times of COVID, where practically we are connected in this problem all over the world, but in essence, it's pretty much the same story as it is the climate change, if we are honest. Only that in the climate change, we were less obviously short-term addressed by the problem than we were in the context of the COVID crisis. So I think it's absolutely important that we understand that, which is leading me to the major problem which we share. And the major problem is actually the model which we have created to provide us with the means of living, and that's the economic model. So economic model is fundamentally based on wrong incentives. It is quantity driven. More you produce, higher profits you have, higher are your share contributions or shares incomes which you get from the shares. And we are disregarding to a large extent negative social consequences and totally disregarding the environmental consequences. Only now, when we see them so clearly, we have started seriously to take them into account. So if I would summarize, we are sending to producers and consumers on the markets which are decisive for our behavior, signals like productive capital, it's overvalued and over-rewarded, human capital, it's undervalued and under-rewarded, and natural capital to a large extent it's not valued at all, which it's leading that in the last 20 years, according to the statistic which was published by UN 2018, we have depleted natural capital for 40%. And that's actually indebting future generations with economic system which we have created. Trade is part of that story. And we should understand it in that way. And it could be part of the problem, as commonly it is, but it can certainly be part of the solution. And since I agree with that trade will and should remain also important part of our future lives, we have to set the things right.
Thank you very much for fascinating introductions. When I compare the introductions, or let's say the views, I actually see two ways of dealing with, let's say, with the problem, or the approaches, I would say. The first one is let's say, top-down, trying to use mechanisms through the WTO, through Europe, kind of forcing countries to change their policy. And the other one is trying to change consumer preferences and so trying to change the trade, the way we're trading on how people consume and what they would prefer. One could say, of course, we can do both, but what is the best way to go? I mean, can we go top down without the bottom up approach, actually? I would like to ask this perhaps first to Ms. Bernasconi-Osterwalder.
Thank you very much. It's quite a difficult question, the top down and bottom up. I think it's not only through trade agreements to force countries to change policies. It's more of a cooperation and designing a new way forward to achieve goals, common goals. So I don't think it's top down. The question, it could be top down when the two partners are not on an equal playing field and one has much more maybe economic power and political power over the other. So then you could say that, for example, the EU might force its approach on another one. But I think more and more, the idea is to get a cooperative approach, which doesn't mean that it should be just, completely non-binding and not making commitments. But it's not necessarily top down, is what I would say. So one of the things that in that context, of course, that's quite important is what was mentioned by Geneviève Pons about the standards, right? Because standards are very much about what the consumer wants, but at the same time, you can influence that behavior as well. So, for example, more and more, I think we can say that trade, it has contributed to consumer choice, more choice, has also brought prices down for the consumer. But at the same time, it hasn't really helped the producers or for example, the smaller farmers or even the environment around the production of the product. And so the consumer, first of all, needs to know what's happening. Where does the product come from? What is the whole value chain, the transparency about the value chain? And what I think that Ms. Pons was suggesting is that you can influence that because, of course, you would want the whole value chain to be sustainable. You don't only want to look at one element, which is, the price of the product and the choice, but you want to make sure that the production is sustainable. So I think that production and process and production methods are key. But at the same time, in that case, it shouldn't be top down because the production that is harming the environment could be in a country, or often is in a country that is less well off than, for example, Europe. So you can't just top down impose things on how those countries should produce, but you need to find cooperative ways so that it works for everyone along the supply chain. I think that was maybe a little bit too long, but hopefully that makes a little bit of sense.
No, it was. I think it was essential and very interesting. And before I come back to Special Envoy Dion, I perhaps would like to ask to Geneviève Pons, what would you react to that? I mean, do you completely agree, or I mean, how do you see that?
Thank you, for your question, and I would like to react on what Janez Potočnik has said first, because I share his views so much. I was in the Jacques Delors cabinet in the 90s, and we were inventing social sustainable development for Europe, with the so-called at that time economic, social and environmental pillars. That's the way we called them at that time. But after Jacques Delors disappeared from the European scene, at least the head of the European Commission, I must say that we departed very much from sustainable development, with terrible consequences. As far as trade is concerned, trade is part of the problem, and trade is part of the solution. Trade is not at the root of the problem, and trade is not probably not the most powerful tool to overcome that, but it has a role to play. So this was for what Janez said. Now, for your question and what Nathalie has said, I must say that I am very much in agreement with her. I think that consumers have a very important role to play, but it has to be an informed role. They must know where their products can come from. And that's why I consider that the Parliament resolution on deforestation-free products is very, very interesting, because it will be about due diligence of all the actors along the supply chain. They have to ensure that the product that will finally enter the European market is deforestation-free. I think that everybody has a role to play, and the consumer has its role to play if he is well informed. Others have a role to play. And now, coming back to trade, I think that we should have a cooperative approach to our main trading partners, the strong ones. We can forget if we are not able to do so. I take the example of the extension of ETS to aviation. And the problem is that if we don't do it after having had proper dialogue with our main partners, it ends up in retaliation, and finally it is abandoned. So we should have this cooperative approach with our main trading partners, and now we can. And second, we must have a supportive approach towards the developing countries, and especially the least developing countries, and help them transition towards this economy.
Thank you. I have a question for you, Special Envoy Dion. You are the big specialist, I would say, from the CETA, of course, Canadian-European Trade Agreement, and where, as you said, there are elements, at least for climate and environment. And since the period it has been in place, has it changed anything in Europe or Canada towards climate change and environment? Do you have any, perhaps also examples of it? I mean, how did it work so far? I mean, that might be interesting if we talk further about possibilities of trade agreements for climate change.
Yes, I'm first, Mr. Debeuf. I'm told that in my introductory remarks, I a bit misspoke. I spoke about the cooperation between Canada and Czechoslovakia. I guess I wanted to say the cooperation between Canada and the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And maybe it's because in my memory, it was so difficult to win against Czechoslovakia in house hockey that I cannot stop myself to think about that. But I would say CETA is not only an improvement regarding the fact that the clean tech, there are no tariffs on clean tech anymore, so it's helping. But trade is more than only trade. It's also opportunities to sit together, to cooperate, to have more scientific cooperation, also to foresee what we will do in the future. I think a key point, for example, would be hydrogen. Germany wants to make hydrogen the next source of energy for the country, but they don't have a strong capacity to produce clean hydrogen by themselves. Canada is in a situation to provide that. So the fact that we have CETA will help us to do this transition in this direction. Now, if you want, if you allow me, I would like just to mention the fact that I'm well aware that we'll need to improve our trade practices, and an agreement like CETA will not stop this improvement. So I don't know where the EU will go with the carbon border adjustment mechanism. I must say I understand the logic. The logic is to avoid carbon leakage, companies leaving the EU and going in countries less demanding about their climate policies. Because if you have carbon leakage, not only the activities, the economic activities of these companies will go in other part of the world, but their greenhouse gas emissions as well, and the planet will be not better off if we have carbon leakage. So I understand the logic. I understand the logic also to avoid the companies coming from countries that are poor in their climate policies to be more competitive in the EU market in an unfair way. And also I must say that if countries have carbon border adjustment mechanism, it will help each country to argue for carbon pricing and strong carbon policies in their own countries. Canada has a electoral campaign 1 year ago, where the government had difficulties to be re-elected, partly because its carbon policy is not popular through the country. So if we are able to explain to Canadians, look, if we want to trade with the EU, we need to have a strong climate policy, including carbon policy, it will be a great help around the world, I would say. This being said, the design will be very tricky. Is it the fact that a country has carbon pricing? Then Canada is okay, we have one. But President Biden, elected President Biden, he wants to invest $1 trillion to green the American economy. He campaigned on it, and he won on it. Yes, he won. But he did not campaign on carbon pricing. He did not campaign on carbon pricing. So will the EU impose a border or border tax on the US economy when the new president is starting a big change in the US economy? If the EU does that, imagine what kind of retaliation the US would do right away. And at the end of the day, these tensions, these trade tensions between these two giants will certainly hurt the planet and our ability to do the transition. So I'm just warning that we need to look at, with the experts we have at this table, I'm very impressed by the suggestions that have been made. We need to be very careful in the way we will design this kind of mechanism. As I said in my introductory remarks, it must help greening the economy through trade and not prevent it through damaging protectionism.
Thank you very much. Before I go back to Ms. Geneviève Pons concerning the mechanism, I would first like to touch upon another point which has been mentioned a few times, and that is what to do with developing or less developed countries or developing countries, the poorer countries. As you said in your presentation, Mr. Potočnik, you said the richer countries have 3 to 7 times bigger footprint than poorer countries. So if we want to include in our trade, this kind of higher standards, will it not increase the unfair trade that is already there today? Isn't this a big question mark? I heard already we have to adjust, we have to do this and this. Is our trade policy, we make it more climate friendly, not going to be more unequal, actually, in world trade?
Yeah, difficult one. The world, it's not fair. And the obligation which the developed countries have, it's huge. That's absolutely clear. And I think we have to be also clear about that. And this is sometimes terribly misunderstood, that the real need for change when we talk about implementing sustainable development goals lies in developing countries. It's just the contrary. It's in developed countries. We are those who are basically responsible for many of the side effects which we are today facing. And we absolutely have to approach to those countries with an open heart, with help, and design the things in a way, in particular in the governance, that in whatever development the world will take, they will take the share which will fairly approach the quality of life which they deserve and approach it to the quality of life which we have. But if you would allow me, just very quick comments on the things which you asked the colleagues before. I definitely agree with the special envoy that we have to approach to those questions carefully with one remark. Unfortunately, we don't have time. So we need to agree fast about those things, and we need to move, because it's pretty obvious that we can't address those problems with that they would be the victims of the political vanity in one or another country or continent. We are so much interconnected, and the problems are so close and so obvious that we simply need to cooperate more. Full stop. The second comment would be, indeed, the process is extremely important. I agree with that. I was basically even proposing that maybe we would need something like we have a convention when we talk about climate change or biodiversity, where we have CBD, that we would need a kind of a convention on natural resource management, which would set the relations in economic world and including the trade a bit more on the equal footing, because we will need some equal footing and some equal understanding what are the things which are the most obvious and which we would need to address. Geneviève was very rightly pointing to some nice moments in the history of the European Union, but I think with the European Green Deal we have a new hope. It's a document which is very bluntly saying that economic development and well-being development should go hand in hand with environmental preservation and with social story, because if it does not go like that, it will simply not go. And I think that's a very clear position on which we should all collectively build. And finally, on the question which you ask on top-down and bottom-up, unpopular answer, but very much the true answer. It will always be both. But what we have to agree and what we have to maintain or build, it's consistency between bottom-up and top-down. That's many times actually really missing. If I just give you an example of how the things on the markets today work. So we are sending the signals to producers and consumers, buy more, no problem. You will anyway not pay the cost for the environmental degradation. This will be taken later by the society. You will contribute a bit, but don't care about that. So do that. And if you will do that, you will actually stimulate the economic development. So great. But on the other hand, we are, as consumers and as citizens, worried because we see what are the challenges which we are facing. And then we create regulation, we create public funding, which is actually trying to address those problems which we are creating in the marketplace. So consumers are confused, because if you are a consumer and you have to pay much more if you are responsible, if you are taking signal which we are getting, and then you are by either public funding or some regulation which is trying to remedy that. So it's a lot of confusion on the markets, to be honest, a lot of lobbying, which is a consequence of that, and a lot of bad will. So fundamentally, we have to align and bring consistency in our behavior on the markets, and that should be consistent with policy making, and that it's including, of course, fully also the trade implications.
Thank you. I mean, as said, let me go 1 second back to you, Geneviève Pons. Special Envoy already explained more or less the idea or from the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but can you come back to it? Like, I mean, what exactly would it do, and perhaps also, I mean, how much chance does it have to be successful and on the shorter term?
Thank you for the question. I very rapidly come back to the Green Deal, because I want to say that I am very much in agreement with Janez Potočnik. It has been a very good surprise, and the package that has been released for recovery makes the Green Deal not only a very good idea, but something that can be financed. Okay, so hopefully 2 member states will finally lift their veto. That's one point. Finally, on what the Special Envoy has said, yes, I think he knows CBAM very well, and what it is intended to do, and what are the obstacles. I must say I very much agree with him. We should not put accent on the tools. We should put accent on the objective. The objective is that we should go all together towards carbon neutrality as soon as possible, to save our planet and to respect the Paris Agreement. That is the objective. And now, how to do it? I think that we have the conditions now to go all together at a very high level. So let's say Mr. Biden in a few weeks or months, Mr. Xi Jinping, the European Union leaders, and probably many others, including Canada, New Zealand, and a lot of very, I would say, green states, with nuances, of course. Go all together and look at the way we will achieve carbon neutrality. That is, we have a common objective, and we will try to get the answers right. Among these answers, we have the carbon price. We have, yes, the price signal. I mean, we must give a price signal to economic actors. That is what Janez Potočnik said. We have not valued natural capital. We should put a price on this capital, and giving a price to CO2 is a way to repair some of the damages that have been created to the nature. And one of the ways to give a price to carbon is this famous carbon border adjustment mechanism. But once again, it is not the objective, it is a tool. And we can, I think that it is possible to reach an agreement on this mechanism. It is possible. I would not say that it is likely, because it is difficult, but it is possible with the goodwill and being very smart, but we can do it. And so, but don't forget that it is only one way to achieve the objective.
Thank you very much. That makes it clear. So I would say, before we go to the public questions, one last question to Ms. Bernasconi-Osterwalder. Trade agreements, in order to be made, it takes years, as the Special Envoy knows very well. I mean, every trade agreement is extremely difficult, and once it's concluded, like recently with Japan, it's an enormous process that has been gone through on so many levels with so many countries. I remember that one of my countries here in Belgium, I'm from Brussels, was blocking the agreement with Canada because of some detail within. So if you put, let's say, all these extra standards in it, all these extra leverages in it, I mean, will we be able to have agreements, trade agreements in the future? I mean, it will make it even more difficult. And let's say with Canada, it was not easy, but still it's Canada. But if we want to do it with Brazil, for example, or with Nigeria, just to say, to give a few examples, or Russia for that matter, I mean, yeah, it's going to make things perhaps too difficult. I mean, so my question is, how big is this political will, even seeing the fact that, for example, some countries in Europe don't even agree with our policy so far?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think one of the first issues to think about is, to what extent should the EU and other countries do, bilateral negotiations or trilateral or whatever? To what extent, what should be brought to that forum compared to the multilateral forum? So I think that's something that isn't off the table. You need to think about it. If you have a multitude of all these different trade agreements, what advantage does that bring? That's just one issue. And one of the reasons that we have all these agreements is possibly or probably because we didn't advance very well on the multilateral front. So what's happening at the multilateral level, even there are now split offs. When countries don't agree altogether, the whole WTO membership, others will come together, some like-minded countries, and start new initiatives. And one recent one, which I welcome very much, is one on that was just launched this week on environment and trade. And sometimes that's to be faster than at the multilateral level. Now, sometimes not ideal because you're leaving out all those other countries that are WTO members. But so I think that's the first question that should always or never be off the table is what do we want? Do we want to try to get multilateral agreement, or to what extent do we compromise that? And where does it make sense? Now on environment, what did I want to say here? Yeah, on environmental issues in trade agreements and how they would make the negotiations more complicated. Well, like I said, some things won't even fit there. So, for example, the border carbon adjustment issue, I don't think it should or can be resolved in a bilateral. It has to be looked at the multilateral level because it affects everyone. It's interrelated. So I think that if we develop a mechanism and a code of conduct that was mentioned, that would have to be done probably in the WTO context. Or in this new context, could explore how to do it, would be this trade and environment split off at the WTO. So that would a possibility. But on bilaterals, yeah, it makes it more complicated. But it's also an opportunity because unfortunately, countries don't as often come together specifically just on environment at the bilateral level as much. And so if you have this relationship on trade, to take the occasion to really look at trade more holistically is a good thing. Now, I may have indicated at the beginning, and I'll stop here, but right now the environmental issues in bilateral agreements are mostly in these distinct chapters, and the bulk, and they're not very ambitious, to tell you the truth. I know we like to be positive about it, but it's not as ambitious as the trade parts. And the trade parts are actually not living up to this new economic model. They're kind of old school. The trade and investment doesn't really integrate a new paradigm where you bring in all these perspectives. So the sustainability perspective is put in a garage with these environmental chapters or sustainability chapters, while the trade part stays quite aggressive and traditional. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think it's time to go to the public and see whether there are any questions. I'm sure there will be. So I'm going back to Prague.
I have here some of the questions, some questions that the public, the audience send us. I remind that you can write your questions down into the chat and we choose some of them and then some of them will be answered. So our first question is, how should the EU approach the new US administration in terms of trade agreements and climate provisions? And please, I'll ask His Excellency Stéphane Dion to answer us. Thank you.
I think we need, that's an excellent question. First thing I want to say, we need US leadership. Nobody may replace the US. If the US don't lead, other countries will do their best, but we will miss a key leader. It's great that elected President Trump, the new elected president, I think it's great that he wants to invest $1 trillion US dollars to green the US economy. So President Biden, that's fantastic. But at the same time, if he does that with only in mind Buy America policy, that to use this greening economy effort in order to have a protectionist policy, it will deprive all the innovation that may come from the Czech Republic, from Europe in general, from Canada, to help the Americans to green their economy. And if they do that, many countries will retaliate too. And they will not have the ability to have access to the US innovative capacity as it should. So it's very important that we convince our US friends, yes, now they are back in the Paris Agreement and the world effort to transition toward a no emission economy. It's very important that they understand that they need to do this in a multilateral way through progressive trade, inclusive trade. Include us, please. We'll help you to succeed, and we need your help. That's, I think, the message we need to send to the United States with their new president.
Thank you very much. I'll ask also Ms. Geneviève Pons if you can add your point of view. Thank you very much.
Okay, so there is an obvious progress at the head of the United States, and I agree with the special envoy that it makes a very big difference. And I think that it goes much beyond a simple question of style. We have now a much more civilized style, much more normal attitude, but it goes beyond. I think that there are convictions, and there are convictions about the necessity to preserve the environment. The question of Buy American is an important question, but it cannot go too far. I think that it's politically useful for Mr. Biden to mention that, but we know that the interconnection of the economies is so advanced that such an attitude will not go very far. So it does not escape to my mind, and this is probably something which makes things a bit more difficult. But I think that we can go together in the right direction, and we can, with the new US administration, green the multilateral trade agenda. There is a dynamic inside the WTO. You know that this week in Geneva is devoted to greening trade. And there are real progress that are made. Canada is part of the coalition, the Green Coalition, and New Zealand is part of it. The EU is part of it, of course. And Well, what we can hope, and it becomes likely, is that the US will be part of it, and then everything will become possible again.
Thank you very much for your complex answers. And let's go to another question of our public. How should we persuade less developed nations to trade in more environmental way without being hypocritical, as we emitted much of emissions through our growth? And I ask for the first answer, Mrs. Nathalie Bernasconi-Osterwalder. Thank you.
Yes, that's always the million-dollar question. It's hard. For sure, developing countries who are generally not responsible for most of our big environmental global problems need to get proper support financially and also in terms of cooperation on capacity building and helping. But at the same time, I think that the economic sector, the economic players, the different companies who are responsible for the value chains need to take responsibility as well. And so if you have it's the companies, yes, that value chain need to ensure that not only are the workers treated properly, but also the environment isn't harmed, and possibly even good is done to the environment, positive effects. So I think that the bottom line is we can't only think of this as a government issue, but really the economic players have to take on responsibility to contribute to sustainable production in those countries where they are active. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a small moment, please. If you're here with us and your sound isn't good and you're hearing something from the mirror hall, please refresh your website, refresh it, or close the mirror hall website if you want to stay here with us in the main hall. So there won't be any problem, there won't be any more problem with the sound. So we can continue and you will hear everything what is needed. Thank you very much. And I'll go back to our guests and I'll continue. I have the same question. I'll remind it. How should we persuade less developed nations to trade in more environmental way without being hypocritical, as we emitted much of emissions through our growth? And I want to know also the answer of Mr. Janez Potočnik. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've been many times involved in those types of talks, and the lesson which I have learned and which I would basically recommend to everybody is whenever you talk to those people, you have to be sincere and you have to take them extremely seriously. And the first thing which you have to do in any kind of talks is explain them in detail what you will do yourself, that you will change the things at home so that they start to take you seriously. Second, explain them how you intend to help them, that their transition would be easier and that the problems which could potentially occur will be overcome. And third, explain them why this time you are sincere. So they need to feel that it is different. And here, maybe also in the context of the things which were said before by the colleagues, in particularly this, I think this joint objective, Geneviève, which you basically underlined, I think it's something around which we should build stories and approach. The first thing we should be aware is that the transition to a more sustainable economy and society, it's unavoidable. Full stop. If we understand that, we have done half of the way. So it is not anymore about how, it is just about how. It is not anymore about what, and it's not anymore about who, because we will do it all together, and we have, otherwise it will simply not be properly done. So where I see, and where some of the colleagues have underlined also very rightly, the problem and the worry is that for political purposes, sometimes we see also through our democratic systems that we are pushing a lot of polarization among citizens and a lot of manipulation with simply wrong facts and data, which do not help anybody. And I think it's essentially important, if we want to address those things, that we do not basically repeat some of the mistakes done through the history, because human history, it's not a very good history. It's a history of many failures, many wars and conflicts, and not the history of a lot of cooperation. So let's be as smart as we can be, and let's cooperate on the issues which are today obvious. We are interconnected. We are connected by the trade. We are connected by the transport. We are connected by tourism. We are connected by common challenges which we have either in the health area, either in the climate. They will become even more frequent than now. It's obvious. That's obvious. And we can address them much better together and in cooperation.
Thank you very much. His Excellency Stéphane Dion wants to react, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to add to the excellent comments we just said about that. Here again, the task is enormous, and I think we need to focus on some key issues, and I will mention two of them, coal and water. Coal. 40% of the electricity of the world is coming from coal as we speak, from the 7,000 coal power plants in the world, plus 1,000 that is planned or in construction, 40% of the electricity. You have, as we speak, 1% out of 9 without access to electricity, according to the World Bank. 1 out of 9. Will they have access to electricity through coal? That would be a tragedy for the world. So that's something that we need to focus on. And it's why the UK and Canada started the Coal Power Past Alliance, to be sure that we'll work all together. If for Germany, it takes until 2038 to without coal, a country with so much technological capacity like Germany. Imagine for India what it would mean to replace coal by an affordable, clean source of electricity. So that's, I think, a main target that we need to have. And I'm sure that if we design trade better than what we are doing today, it would be a great help. And the other one, I don't have the time to develop too much, but it is water. If I had to choose what is the challenge of this century, before climate change, I would say water, access to clean water for human beings. Climate change will make it worse, but it's not climate change that is doing all this pollution and is pumping all the water from everywhere. And so don't forget that even without climate change, we would have ecological crisis in the world, and it would be a lot linked to our mismanagement of water. Canada has, again, a lot to offer about water management, and I think we should do more as a country for that.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I saw that Nathalie Bernasconi-Osterwalder was waving. She agrees. If I saw you well, is there something you want to add? Any remarks?
No, I was just very pleased to hear that the issue of water was raised, because sometimes it used to be kind of an issue that was very much on top of the global talks, let's say, but I think it kind of lost traction, and it's still going to be the source of great conflict in many places, and we have to really keep track of that. So water, I was just very happy to hear that this was mentioned, because sometimes in these days we've been forgetting about the urgency of looking at water issues.
Thank you very much, and let's
So-
go to thank you. Let's go to another question of our audience. How should we persuade less developed nations to trade in more environmental way? Sorry. We had this one already, so another. How can we ensure having relevant information if the products are from countries whose ability to provide such info is limited? Infrastructure trustworthiness. So please, Mrs. Geneviève Pons.
Well, it's coming back to what many of us have said. We have, as developed countries, a high responsibility in the present state of the world, and we have financial means to repair them. And so we have a special responsibility towards developing countries, and especially the least developed ones. It is nothing new. It is written in the Paris Agreement, for instance, with the notion of common and differentiated responsibility. So I think that we have a duty to support them, and especially as far as trade is concerned, to help them going on this pathway of greening their trade relations. So I think it's our duty.
Thank you very much. Let's go to another question we have here. While trade is important, exploitation is unacceptable. How can the EU take a world lead in reducing exploitation and corruption? So, Mr. Janez Potočnik, your opinion?
Yeah, with more sincerity and with clearly changing some of the governance practices which were present in the past. I think that European Green Deal, it's actually an excellent opportunity that we divert from, if I can say it, a kind of resource imperialism which many countries and continents have practiced in the past. And let's take that opportunity and let's put the things on a bit different footing. And if I'm allowed to comment also, just to add on what was a very important comment coming from the Special Envoy, International Resource Panel, which I'm co-chairing, as explained before, it's actually dealing exactly with those questions. It's dealing with biomass, metals, non-metallic materials, fossil fuels, water, and land. So natural resources. And yes, it is true. It's not that the climate change is the reason for anything. Climate change is the consequence. But since we are in the climate change, the extreme weather events and other things are actually then potentially influencing again on depletion of those natural resources. But the real reason for the depletion of natural resources lies in the real driver, and the real driver is human behavior and economic systems. That's why I'm so much pointing into direction that focus on the real drivers, which are at the end causing that we have problems with water, that we have problems with land, because land is the most limited resource, if we are honest, and the demand for land is terrible and will continue all across the world. And I agree with you also that water is also an enormous problem, in particular drinking water, of course. And bio here again will become a very, very serious issue. And those debate, whenever we come to those questions, are very delicate, and we need to find the proper balance. But really focusing on the real drivers and pressures which are causing the consequences, I think it's essential if we want to find the answers.
Thank you very much. The question is, how can the EU take a world lead in reducing exploitation and corruption? And I'll pass the floor shortly also to Mrs. Nathalie Bernasconi-Osterwalder, just to add her point of view.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just raising my hand here because, as I mentioned earlier, I think that there's a due diligence obligation on those that the actors that control value chains, So definitely, this is also true with respect to the issue of corruption and exploitation. I think that trade agreements currently, of course, are not only trade agreements, they're trade and investment agreements. And currently, trade agreements provide quite a few rights to investors, protections and other rights. And so there is a real movement to discuss the need for also integrating obligations and responsibilities for investors in the same agreements to counterbalance the rights that they're granted under these agreements. And the OECD is doing quite a bit of work on that right now. And the EU is definitely also, to my knowledge, the Commission is looking into this quite a bit as well. So I just wanted to mention that it's a very important issue, and since it came up, I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so I'd love to thank all our guests, His Excellency Stéphane Dion, Mrs. Nathalie Bernasconi-Osterwalder, Mrs. Geneviève Pons, and Mr. Janez Potočnik. And I'd love to thank also Koert Debeuf for moderating this lovely debate. Thank you and have a nice day.